In the place you go to be saved, a monster was hiding in plain sight. For 16 years, he was a quiet, dependable nurse, the one you'd trust with your life in the ICU's fragile twilight hours. But while his colleagues saw a caregiver, Charles Cullen was secretly turning the tools of healing into instruments of death. He weaponized compassion, stalking the hospital hallways and choosing his victims at will, becoming what could be the most prolific serial killer in American history. This is the story of the Angel of Death and the terrifying systemic failure that allowed him to murder hundreds. Welcome to the Dark Chapters. In the high-pressure, life-and-death world of hospital intensive care units, there is a certain type of nurse who is invaluable. They are the quiet ones, the ones who don't seek the spotlight, who seem to thrive in the chaotic environment of the night shift. They are calm under pressure, reliable, and always willing to take on the most difficult cases or pick up an extra shift when the unit is short-staffed. They are the dependable workhorses who keep the hospital running while the rest of the world sleeps. For 16 years, across 9 different hospitals and a nursing home in New Jersey and Pennsylvania, Charles Cullen was the epitome of this nurse. He was quiet, experienced, and seemingly dedicated. Colleagues saw him as a private but competent professional, a man you could count on in a crisis. But beneath this placid, helpful exterior, a horrific secret was festering. Charles Cullen was not saving lives. He was methodically, secretly, and prolifically taking them, embarking on one of the most terrifying and sustained killing sprees in American history, all while wearing the trusted uniform of a caregiver. Charles Cullen's journey into darkness began long before he ever donned a pair of scrubs. His childhood was a grim tapestry of trauma and instability. Born in West Orange, New Jersey in 1960, he was the youngest of 8 children in a devoutly Catholic working-class family. His life was marked by tragedy from the very beginning. His father, a bus driver, died when Cullen was just 7 months old. His mother was killed in a car accident when he was a teenager. He described his childhood as miserable, claiming to have been bullied relentlessly at school. This early instability created a deeply troubled young man. At the age of 9, he made his first suicide attempt by drinking chemicals from a chemistry set. It was the first of some 20 attempts he would make throughout his life. Desperate for a sense of structure and purpose, he dropped out of high school and enlisted in the U.S. Navy. Here, he found a place where his intelligence and quiet demeanor could be put to use. He served on a nuclear submarine, the USS Woodrow Wilson, rising to the rank of petty officer. But the Navy could not contain the demons that plagued him. He continued to be a social outcast, and his odd behavior and escalating mental health issues made him a target. After being discovered in a stolen uniform in the captain's chair, he was reassigned to a less stressful role on a supply ship. The transfer did little to help. He was discharged from the Navy in 1984 after another suicide attempt. Adrift and with few prospects, he decided to enroll in nursing school, perhaps seeking a profession where he could finally find acceptance and control. He graduated from Mountainside Hospital's nursing school in 1986 and took his first job at St. Barnabas Medical Center in Livingston, New Jersey. On the surface, he excelled. He appeared to be a model nurse, especially in the high-stress environment of the burn unit. But it was here, amidst the suffering of the most vulnerable patients, that his secret reign of terror began. He discovered that he had a unique and terrible power. By accessing the hospital's supply of intravenous bags and medications, he could become an invisible arbiter of life and death. His weapon of choice was digoxin, a powerful heart medication that, when administered in a lethal overdose, could induce a fatal cardiac arrest while being difficult to detect in a standard autopsy. He would silently inject the drug into the IV bags of patients, then sit back and watch as they suddenly and inexplicably crash. When a code blue was called, Cullen would often be one of the first to respond, calmly participating in the frantic efforts to save the very patient he had just poisoned. He watched families weep. He watched doctors struggle to understand the sudden turn for the worse. And no one ever suspected the quiet, helpful nurse in the corner. His first confirmed murder was in 1988. From there, he began a terrifying pattern. He would work at a hospital for a period, during which the number of unexplained patient deaths would spike. Suspicions might eventually arise. Whispers might start among other nurses who noticed the strange correlation between Cullen's shifts and the number of codes. But these suspicions were rarely, if ever, acted upon. The reasons for this were systemic. In the 1990s and early 2000s, hospitals were deeply afraid of lawsuits and scandals. Firing a nurse for suspicion alone without definitive proof could lead to a wrongful termination suit. Instead of confronting the issue head-on, a disturbing pattern emerged. When Cullen came under any kind of internal review, the hospital would quietly dismiss him or pressure him to resign. They would then, crucially, give him a neutral or even a positive reference to pass along to his next employer. They were not solving the problem. They were simply passing their problem nurse along to another unsuspecting hospital. Furthermore, a severe nursing shortage at the time meant that experienced ICU and critical care nurses like Cullen were in high demand. Hospitals were so desperate for qualified staff that they often overlooked red flags in an employment history, eager to fill a vacant spot on the night shift. This broken system allowed Cullen to move with impunity. He left St. Barnabas and went to Warren Hospital in Phillipsburg, New Jersey, where he murdered several elderly patients. When the cloud of suspicion grew too thick there, he moved on again. He went from hospital to hospital, a specter of death drifting through the sterile hallways of Hunterdon Medical Center, Morristown Memorial Hospital, and several others. At each stop, the pattern repeated. A quiet, competent nurse is hired. The death rate of his patients mysteriously climbs, and after a period of whispers and quiet internal reviews, he moves on, his record scrubbed clean for the next facility. For over a decade, Charles Cullen operated in plain sight, protected by a culture of fear and a system that prioritized its own liability over the safety of its patients. The quiet nurse continued his work, leaving a trail of grieving families and baffled doctors in his wake. His true nature hidden behind a mask of serene professionalism. The career of Charles Cullen became a horrifying metronome, marking time with a steady, rhythmic beat of death that followed him from one hospital to the next. The pattern was insidious, hiding in the statistical noise of an already high mortality environment. In the intensive care and cardiac care units where Cullen chose to work, death was a constant presence. Patients were fragile, their lives hanging by a thread. This chaos was his camouflage. It allowed him to operate for 16 years, not as a rogue agent, but as a systemic plague, exploiting the very trust that was the bedrock of his profession. His trail of death was not a straight line, but a series of terrifying, concentrated clusters, each one flaring up in a new location before he would quietly move on, leaving behind a legacy of confusion, grief, and unanswered question. After leaving his first position at St. Barnabas under a cloud of unproven suspicion, Cullen arrived at Warren Hospital in New Jersey in 1992. Here, the pattern began to solidify and escalate. His weapon of choice expanded. While digoxin remained a favorite for its ability to mimic a natural heart attack, He began to experiment with other potent medications readily available in any ICU. He developed a fatal fondness for insulin, a drug that, when administered to a non-diabetic patient, could plunge their blood sugar to catastrophic, irreversible lows, causing brain death while appearing as a sudden, unexplained seizure or coma. At Warren, he murdered 3 elderly female patients by injecting them with lethal doses of digoxin. One of his victims was a 91-year-old woman recovering from breast cancer surgery. She was stable, expected to be discharged, but she died suddenly and violently of a heart attack during one of Cullen's shifts. Her family was devastated, but had no reason to suspect foul play. In a woman of her age, a heart attack was a tragic but plausible event. This was the core of Cullen's evil genius. He chose vulnerabilities, age, critical illness, the inherent risks of a hospital stay, and used them as a shield for his actions. When suspicions among his colleagues at Warren eventually started to mount after a series of strange deaths, Cullen took a familiar path. He didn't wait to be fired, he simply resigned and moved on, the whispers dying down behind him as he sought fresh hunting grounds. His personal life was simultaneously imploding, a chaotic storm that seemed to fuel his murderous compulsion. His wife, increasingly terrified by his erratic behavior, his cruelty to the family dogs, and his dark moods, filed for divorce and restraining orders against him. He was breaking into neighbors' houses, making threatening phone calls, and his multiple suicide attempts landed him in various psychiatric facilities. Yet, incredibly, none of this turmoil prevented him from getting hired. He would check himself out of a psychiatric ward one day and be back on an ICU floor the next, his nursing license intact, his employment history sanitized by the fear-driven policies of his former employers. He arrived at Hunterdon Medical Center in Flemington, New Jersey, where he worked for several years. The pattern continued. He was seen as a skilled, if odd, practitioner. But death followed him. Colleagues began to notice the eerie coincidences. It was an open secret among some nurses that you didn't want Charles Cullen looking after your family member. They noticed that he seemed to have a sixth sense for which patients were about to, often predicting a crash moments before it happened. They noticed that sealed IV bags would sometimes feel slightly damp, or that medication supplies seemed to dwindle on his shifts. But these were just feelings, fragments of suspicion without proof. How could you accuse a fellow nurse, a man who seemed so dedicated, of something so monstrous? To do so would be to admit a horror into their world that was too terrible to contemplate. The advent of computerized medication dispensing cabinets, like the Pyxis system, should have stopped him. These machines were designed to track every pill and vial, creating a clear audit trail. But Cullen, intelligent and observant, quickly learned how to exploit the system's weaknesses. He discovered that he could request a drug for one patient, but then cancel the request before the machine's drawer opened. The system would register the cancellation, but for a brief window, the machine's entire inventory would be accessible. In these few seconds, Cullen could pull out lethal drugs like insulin or epinephrine, and the withdrawal would not be linked to his name or any specific patient. He became a master of this digital sleight of hand, acquiring his weapons with electronic invisibility. After a long string of hospitals in New Jersey, he crossed state lines into Pennsylvania, working at Easton Hospital, Lehigh Valley Hospital, and St. Luke's Hospital in Bethlehem. The change in scenery did nothing to alter the routine. At St. Luke's, his behavior grew bolder, more reckless. He murdered a patient with a paralytic drug, a substance with no therapeutic use for the patient in question, an act that finally raised a red flag that could not be ignored. Another nurse reported seeing Cullen in the rooms of patients who were not assigned to him shortly before they died. An internal investigation began, but true to form, Cullen simply resigned in the middle of it and accepted a new position before he could be fired. His final stop was Somerset Medical Center in Somerville, New Jersey in 2002. He was hired into the critical care unit despite a work history that should have been a screaming siren of warning signs. By now, the nursing shortage was so acute, that a warm body with a valid license and ICU experience was almost guaranteed a job. At Somerset, the pattern became a terrifying crescendo. In just a few months, the number of inexplicable deaths and code blue emergencies skyrocketed. The hospital's supply of digoxin, a drug rarely used, was suddenly being depleted at an alarming rate. Doctors and pharmacists were baffled. Patients who were stable and on the verge of being moved out of the ICU were suddenly dying of heart attacks or crashing from critically low blood sugar. The one common denominator in almost every single one of these tragic, inexplicable events was the quiet, helpful nurse on the night shift. Charles Cullen, the specter of death, had found a new home, and the whispers that had followed him for 16 years were about to become a desperate scream for help. The 16-year killing spree of Charles Cullen was not just the story of a lone, monstrous individual. It was the story of a catastrophic systemic failure, a tragedy enabled by a culture of fear, denial, and a profound breakdown in the very safeguards designed to protect patients. At nearly every one of the 9 hospitals where he worked, suspicions about Cullen arose. There were whispers in the break rooms, uneasy glances exchanged over patients who crashed unexpectedly, and quiet concerns voiced by nurses who noticed that death seemed to follow him like a shadow. Yet, for 16 years, these suspicions were consistently, and in some cases deliberately, ignored. The reasons for this inaction are as chilling as Cullen's crimes themselves, revealing a healthcare system that prioritized its own self-preservation over the lives of its most vulnerable. The primary engine of this failure was a pervasive culture of fear within hospital administrations. In the litigious environment of American healthcare, the threat of a lawsuit was a powerful deterrent to decisive action. Administrators knew that firing a nurse based on suspicion alone, without irrefutable smoking gun evidence, was a significant legal risk. Cullen could sue for wrongful termination or slander, potentially costing the hospital millions of dollars in legal fees and damages, not to mention the devastating blow to its public reputation. It was far easier, cheaper, and safer for the institution to not see what it did not want to see. This led to a horrifying unwritten policy of passing the problem. When suspicions about Cullen would reach a critical mass, when too many nurses had complained or too many deaths had clustered on his shifts, the hospital would launch a quiet, internal review. But the goal of these reviews often seemed less about uncovering the truth and more about mitigating liability. Cullen would be confronted, but he would deny everything, with no definitive proof. The hospital's hands were seemingly tied. The solution was almost always the same. They would pressure him to resign or simply terminate his employment for a minor infraction, and then, crucially, provide him with a neutral or even satisfactory reference for his next job. This act of institutional cowardice was repeated time and time again. Each hospital, in protecting itself, effectively scrubbed his record clean, handing a loaded weapon to the next unsuspecting facility down the line. Compounding this problem was a severe nationwide nursing shortage during the 1990s and early 2000s. Experienced, highly trained nurses willing to work the grueling night shift in an ICU or CCU were worth their weight in gold. Hospitals were locked in fierce competition for qualified staff. Cullen's resume, on paper, was attractive. He had years of critical care experience and was always willing to pick up extra shifts. Desperate hiring managers, under pressure to keep their units staffed, were inclined to overlook red flags. A resume showing a string of short-term jobs at multiple hospitals, something that should have prompted a rigorous background check, was often ignored in the rush to fill a vital position. Cullen's mobility was not just his own choice. It was enabled by a system so desperate for labor that it failed to perform the most basic due diligence. Within the hospital walls, another powerful force was at play: the psychology of denial among his colleagues. The bond between nurses is forged in a high-stress environment of shared responsibility and mutual trust. The idea that one of your own, a person you work alongside, a person you trust to care for patients, could be a prolific serial killer is a concept so monstrous it is almost impossible to process. It was easier to rationalize the anomalies. A sudden death was attributed to the patient's fragile condition. A strange medication order was a simple mistake. The statistical spike in deaths during Cullen's shifts was just a terrible, tragic coincidence. To voice a suspicion was to break a professional taboo and risk being labeled a troublemaker or worse, being wrong. At St. Luke's Hospital in Pennsylvania, several nurses grew so concerned about Cullen that they met privately to share their fears. They noticed he was spending time with patients not assigned to him, moments before they would inexplicably die. One brave nurse took these concerns to the local district attorney's office, but without internal support from the hospital and with no concrete evidence, the complaint went nowhere. Cullen, sensing the walls closing in, simply resigned and moved to his final posting at Somerset Medical Center, his dark secret still intact. It was at Somerset that the pattern of ignored suspicion reached its tragic crescendo, and where it would finally be broken. Within months of his arrival in 2002, the ICU became a scene of inexplicable carnage. The death rate soared. Patients who were stable, even joking with their families one moment, were dying the next. The hospital's computerized Pyxis machine showed a bizarre pattern of medication withdrawals under Cullen's name. He was accessing lethal drugs like digoxin and insulin, often for patients to whom they had not been prescribed, and then immediately canceling the transactions. Even here, with clear data pointing directly at him, the initial response was muddled by fear and indecision. Hospital administrators were slow to act, worried about the legal and public relations fallout. They held meetings, reviewed charts, but for weeks they allowed Cullen to continue working, to continue having access to vulnerable patients. It took the unwavering determination of a few key individuals to finally pierce the veil of institutional denial. A hospital pharmacist, who first noticed the alarming digoxin orders, refused to let the issue go. And a brave fellow nurse, Amy Loughran, who had considered Cullen a friend, finally looked at the evidence compiled by investigators and agreed to help them. The weight of the deaths, the sheer statistical impossibility of it all, had become too great to ignore. The whispers had finally become a scream, loud enough for the outside world to hear, but for countless victims over 16 years, it had come far too late. The walls of denial that had protected Charles Cullen for 16 years finally began to crumble within the corridors of Somerset Medical Center. The sheer number of unexplained deaths in the ICU had become a statistical impossibility, a cluster of tragedies so dense it could no longer be dismissed as coincidence or bad luck. The system that had failed so many for so long was finally, and reluctantly, being forced to confront the monster it had helped create. The process of catching him, however, would require more than just data. It would require the extraordinary courage of a few individuals who chose to break the cycle of silence and fear. The first crack in the wall came from an unlikely place, the hospital pharmacy. A diligent pharmacist reviewing medication orders noticed the bizarre and alarming pattern of digoxin withdrawals. He saw that Charles Cullen was ordering lethal doses of the heart medication, often for patients who had no medical need for it, and then canceling the orders after accessing the drug. This pharmacist did what so many others before him had failed to do. He refused to let it go. He raised the alarm with hospital administration, presenting them with clear, documented evidence of suspicious activity. Initially, the hospital's response was frustratingly slow, mired in the familiar fear of legal exposure. They held meetings and reviewed charts, but for weeks they allowed Cullen to keep working, a decision that would prove fatal for several more patients. Frustrated by the hospital's inaction, a hospital risk manager made a courageous decision. Stepping outside the chain of command, she contacted the Somerset County Prosecutor's Office. This single phone call changed everything. It took the investigation out of the hands of a fearful hospital administration and placed it into the world of law enforcement. Two detectives, Tim Braun and Danny Baldwin, were assigned to the case. They were seasoned investigators, but nothing could have prepared them for the labyrinth of medical records and institutional stonewalling they were about to enter. They had no body, no crime scene in the traditional sense, and a suspect who was still actively working with vulnerable patients. Their investigation began with the Pyxis machine records. The digital breadcrumbs Cullen had left behind were damning. They showed a clear and undeniable pattern of him accessing lethal medications just before his patients would mysteriously die. To build a criminal case, however, they needed more than just computer data. They needed to connect his actions directly to the deaths. This meant exhuming bodies to find definitive proof of poisoning. The first body they exhumed was that of Florian Gall, a reverend who had died suddenly and unexpectedly under Cullen's care. The toxicology reports came back positive for a massive lethal overdose of digoxin that had never been prescribed. They finally had their smoking gun. They had proof of murder. But proving one murder was not enough. The detectives suspected the scale of his crimes was far larger. They needed a way to get inside Cullen's world, to understand his methods, and perhaps even to get a confession. They knew confronting him directly would likely cause him to shut down. They needed an intermediary, someone he trusted. Their attention turned to a fellow ICU nurse named Amy Loughran. Amy was a single mother of two young daughters, struggling with a serious heart condition of her own. She was a kind, empathetic woman who had befriended the quiet, awkward nurse on the night shift. She saw Cullen as a gentle, helpful colleague, a friend who supported her through her own health scares. They had bonded over their shared struggles as single parents and the pressures of their demanding jobs. When Detectives Braun and Baldwin first approached her, she was in disbelief. The man they were describing, a cold, methodical serial killer, was not the friend she knew. She defended him, unable to reconcile the two images. The detectives were patient. They didn't push. They simply laid out the evidence. They walked her through the Pyxis records, showing her the timeline of Cullen's drug withdrawals and the corresponding patient deaths. They showed her the toxicology report for Florian Gall. They showed her the long list of unexplained codes that occurred only on his shifts. For Amy, the experience was horrifying. The undeniable facts on the page began to dismantle the image of her friend piece by piece, replacing it with a monstrous truth. The quiet colleague, the supportive friend, it had all been a mask. She realized with a sickening certainty that the man she had confided in, the man she trusted, was a killer. Her disbelief turned to a profound sense of responsibility. She understood that she was in a unique position. She was the only person who could get close to him, the only one he might talk to. In an act of incredible bravery, she agreed to cooperate fully with the police. Her decision would put her own life at risk, but she knew she had to do it to prevent him from killing again. She agreed to wear a wire. The plan was for Amy to meet Cullen at a restaurant after his shift, wearing a hidden microphone, to see if she could get him to talk about the recent deaths. The meeting was excruciatingly tense. Amy, her own heart pounding erratically due to her condition, had to sit across from a man she now knew was a monster and pretend to be his friend. She carefully guided the conversation, talking about the stress of the job, the recent string of deaths, and the ongoing investigation at the hospital. Cullen was cagey, defensive. He didn't confess, but his evasive answers and paranoid demeanor only confirmed the detectives' suspicions. After the restaurant meeting, the detectives knew they had enough to bring him in, but they decided on one final confrontation. They arranged for Amy to meet Cullen again, this time at the police station, under the pretense of discussing the investigation. Wearing the wire one last time, she met him in an interrogation room. The detectives then entered, and the trap was sprung. For hours, Cullen denied everything. He was calm, collected and defiant. He stonewalled every question, his face an emotionless mask. The detectives grew frustrated. It seemed he would never break. But then they brought Amy back into the room. She spoke to him not as an accuser, but as a friend, appealing to his humanity. "I just want to know why," she pleaded. It was this appeal, this final human connection from the one person he thought was his friend, that finally broke through his defenses. He began to talk. The dam of 16 years of secrets finally burst. The quiet nurse, the angel of death, was finally caught. The dam of 16 years of secrets did not just crack, it shattered. In the stark, sterile environment of the police interrogation room, Charles Cullen, the man who had hidden behind a mask of quiet competence for his entire career, began to talk. The initial confession, coaxed out of him by the appeal from his friend Amy Lochran, was just the beginning of a horrifying flood. Over the next 7 months, in a series of chilling interviews with detectives Tim Braun and Danny Baldwin, the true scale of his reign of terror would be revealed, sending shockwaves through the American healthcare system and leaving a legacy of grief and institutional soul-searching that continues to this day. Cullen, realizing he was caught, quickly agreed to a deal with the prosecutors. In exchange for their promise not to seek the death penalty, he would cooperate fully. He would confess to every single murder he had committed in every hospital across 2 states. This deal was not born of compassion for Cullen, but of a desperate need for answers from the authorities. The detectives knew he was the only person on Earth who knew the true number of his victims. Without his confession, countless families would never know if their loved one's death was a tragic medical event or a deliberate act of murder. The confessions were a chilling and surreal process. Cullen would sit with the detectives for hours, a list of patient records spread out before him. His memory was astounding. He could recall, with stunning clarity, the names of patients he had killed over a decade earlier. He would look at a chart and recount the specific drug he used: digoxin, insulin, epinephrine, and the method of delivery. He spoke in a flat, emotionless monotone, the same detached, professional tone he likely used at a patient's bedside. There was no remorse, no flicker of emotion, no sense of the profound gravity of his actions. He spoke of taking human lives with the same dispassion a clerk might use to describe filing paperwork. It was this complete absence of affect that was, perhaps, the most terrifying thing about him. When pressed for a motive, Cullen offered the one that is common among medical killers: mercy. He claimed he was a mercy angel, acting to end the suffering of patients who were critically ill. He insisted he couldn't bear to watch their pain and that his actions were a compassionate release. But this self-serving narrative crumbled under the slightest scrutiny. While some of his victims were indeed terminally ill, many were not. He killed patients who were stable, recovering from surgery, and expected to go home. He murdered Reverend Florian Gall, a man who was improving. He killed a 40-year-old woman, a local politician's mother, who was recovering from an allergic reaction. His choice of victims was not based on their level of suffering, but on their accessibility. He killed because he could, because it gave him a secret, godlike power over life and death. His mercy was a lie he told himself to rationalize an insatiable compulsion. As the interviews continued, the numbers climbed to a staggering height. He confessed to murders at St. Luke's, at Warren Hospital, at Hunterdon Medical Center, a trail of death that snaked back through his entire career. The final official tally was breathtaking. He confessed to and was convicted of 29 murders. But both Cullen and the investigators believe the true number is far, far higher. Due to incomplete records, the time elapsed, and his own hazy memory on some cases, the exact number will never be known. Cullen himself has suggested the true number is closer to 40, and investigators believe he could plausibly be responsible for as many as 400 deaths, which would make him, by a vast margin, the most prolific serial killer in American history. The legal proceedings were a formality leading to a foregone conclusion. In March of 2006, Charles Cullen was brought into a courtroom in Allentown, Pennsylvania, for his final sentencing. The courtroom was packed with the families of his victims, people who had spent years believing their loved ones had died of natural causes, only to be confronted with the horrific truth. One by one, they stood to deliver their victim impact statements, their voices filled with a mixture of raw grief and white-hot rage. Tom Gall, the son of Reverend Florian Gall, looked directly at Cullen and said, "You are not an angel of mercy. You are an agent of Satan sent from the depths of hell." Throughout the heart-wrenching testimony, Cullen remained impassive, staring straight ahead, a black hole of emotion. He was sentenced to 11 consecutive life sentences with no possibility of parole. He would later receive additional life sentences in New Jersey, ensuring he would die in prison. The aftershocks of Cullen's case sent a tremor through the entire healthcare industry. The story was not just about a single killer. It was about the profound systemic failures that allowed him to flourish. The hospitals that had employed him, that had passed him along with neutral references, faced a deluge of lawsuits from the victims' families. Many settled out of court for undisclosed but undoubtedly massive sums. The scandal exposed the dangerous and deeply ingrained culture of protecting the institution at all costs. In response, new laws were passed. New Jersey enacted the Patient Safety Act, which mandated stricter reporting requirements for hospitals and offered greater protection for whistleblowers. The case spurred the development of more sophisticated medication tracking systems and more rigorous background checks for healthcare workers across the country. The era of a hospital being able to quietly dismiss a problem nurse without alerting future employers was, at least in theory, over. But the deepest aftershock was not legal or financial, it was psychological. The Cullen case shattered the sacred trust between patient and caregiver. He had weaponized the very act of nursing, turning a profession of compassion into an instrument of death. For the families of his victims, there is no closure, only the horrifying knowledge that their loved ones died in a place they were supposed to be safe, at the hands of a man they were supposed to trust. The story of Charles Cullen serves as a permanent, chilling reminder that the most terrifying monsters are often the ones who wear a mask of kindness, and that the silence born of fear can be the most deadly accomplice of all. Charles Cullen's story is a chilling reminder that the deepest darkness can be found where we least expect it, not in shadowy alleys, but in the sterile, brightly lit rooms of a hospital. It's a profound and disturbing look at how systems designed to protect us can fail, leaving a path of destruction in their wake. These are the narratives we explore here, the stories that form our darkest chapters. If you believe it's important to uncover these truths and understand the psychology behind them, subscribe to the Dark Chapters and click the notification bell. You won't want to miss the next story we unearth from the shadows.